Unanimous, an Abraxian Wars quick read, written by Darius Simon. Story by David Edward, 2022, copyright Frequency 99, imprint, independently published, Ocala, Florida, USA, all rights reserved. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual events or persons living or dead is entirely coincidental. Chapter 1, A Golden Egg. Commander Thalia of the Machian Defense Fleet squinted as she read the most recent intelligence reports from the space that surrounded the planet Verk-Fa. She read and then reread the same paragraph several times until she was sure that she understood what she was reading. Something strange had happened in the field of space debris left behind after the battle. Small drones of unknown origin and purpose had been discovered flying in and out of the cloud of damaged ships. They were made of metal alloys and other traditional ship components, but their design showed a possible Abraxian influence. They were small enough that initially they did not show up on scans. After being picked up on the collision monitor, they looked like tiny squids with steel tentacles. There were thousands of them out there, so many that it would be impossible to destroy them individually. Like tiny plankton in the ocean, the machines were individually almost invisible, but collectively they were a numberless and diffuse cloud. "What are they doing?" Thalia asked her officers that sat in her dimly lit secure office on MDF Reason. She had met with her team several times throughout the days about the strange machines. She tapped her fingernails on the desk impatiently. "We don't know yet, Commander." "Well, find out," Thalia said. "There are thousands of them out there, and I want to know who they belong to and what they are trying to accomplish." She watched the videos taken from reconnaissance the missions. The drones, possibly Abraxian, swam in wriggling zigzag lines like cosmic string. Then they used their tentacles to latch onto the side of a destroyed ship or a large container. They crawled and skittered across the exterior of the object. They poked, drilled, or pulled it apart before they jettisoned themselves back into space to repeat the process on another interplanetary object. Over the course of a few microcycles, Thalia watched the larger objects and dead ships that orbited Verk-Fa as they got broken down into smaller and smaller chunks, while the squid drones did their work. "It's like they are a kind of bacteria," said one of the intelligence officers. "By breaking down the space trash, they are creating an effect like natural decay. It's almost like the dead ships are decomposing in front of our eyes." "It's not a natural process," said Thalia. "Someone is doing it intentionally. They sent out those drones to break up the debris for a purpose. I want to know who it is, and I want to know why." She couldn't imagine why anyone, least of all the brutal Abraxians, would spend so much technological energy on this type of debris. It certainly made space travel around Verk-Fa safer, but that wasn't exactly the Abraxian modus operandi. If it was them, what were they doing it for? If it wasn't them, who else could it be? Why were all those drones out there? A microcycle later, new intelligence reports came in. Thalia woke herself from a short nap when she got the alert. She had waited for cycles for new information, and when it came in, she was notified immediately. She sat up in bed and went over the new documents. A tracker had been implanted on the exterior of one of the tiny drones. The Reason tracked its movements to the nearby planet Lograt. In orbit was a powerful Abraxian cruiser. Suddenly she put it together. Thalia quickly went to find the captain, Magneus. She handed the reports to the captain. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "This is how we win the war," said Thalia. She could barely contain her excitement. She stood at rigid attention. Her face was flushed red, and there were dark circles under her eyes from exhaustion. "What do you mean?" "We have confirmed the drones we have been monitoring in the space around Verk-Fa are Abraxian salvage machines. They have been breaking down the dead ships in search of valuable materials, rare alloys, fuels, and compounds like genium, metalloid cytarine, and common. The rare materials we need in order to build new ships and weapons," said Magneus as he was formulating a new strategy. "Exactly," said Thalia. "Whoever controls the supply of rare materials in the Luminary has the technological advantage in the next stage of the conflict." "So the Abraxians are mining the debris field with micro-drones," said Magneus. "Very effectively," said Thalia. "There are potentially thousands of pounds of abandoned genium out there. enough to destroy several moons. There are hundreds of tons of metalloid siderine, enough to build 8 or 10 new cruisers. These drones are gathering it all, drop by tiny drop. Our intelligence is showing that they are returning to a large warship orbiting Lograt to deposit the resources. We need to form a plan to take an entire luminary system's worth of natural resources. Yes, sir, Thalia responded. This could be a great advantage for our forces, said Magneus. He gazed at the intelligence reports with the same expression of enthusiasm that had overcome Thalia. Taking that ship would mean taking in enough resources to decisively turn the tide in the war against the Abraxians. It would mean that the Machi would be the best-equipped military force in the Luminary. Thalia said. You said thousands of pounds of genium? We believe so. It could be enough to build hundreds of warheads. We can't allow the Abraxians to surpass us in resources like that. We need to get an attack and control plan put together right away. We cannot let that ship leave the area. We need to recover those materials and return them to the military treasury on Machi, said Magneus. Yes, sir, but we won't be able to do it alone. The cruiser is a Class 3 destroyer. The MDF reason wouldn't stand a chance. We would need at least 3 more Class 2 Machian warships to disable and board an Abraxian destroyer of that magnitude. We couldn't do it with the MDF reason and our gunships? Magneus asked, knowing his warriors were the fiercest in the fleet. No, sir, Thalia said, knowing that their forces could stand up next to anyone's. Magneus stared at the reports and ran through scenarios in his head. The Abraxian destroyer had been built to withstand intense attacks by multiple gunships. The squid drones had deposited their valuable goods on the monolithic destroyer. It was their safe, the bank. The Abraxians assumed that it was the best place to protect the valuable resources they were stealing from the debris field, and they were right. The destroyer would put up a fight. We will need to get help, said Magneus. Set up a meeting with the generals. Sir, are you sure you can trust them? No, but this time I will have to, said Magneus. Thalia nodded and collected the papers she had put down on Magneus's desk while he stared distractedly at the audiovisual monitor that showed the space debris orbiting Verkfa. Oh, and good work with this, he said. Thalia beamed. Praise was rare from Magneus, but always well earned. She knew that she had gone above and beyond her post, having discovered this valuable opportunity. Her heart beat with excitement as she thought about the precious resources that waited to be seized from the Abraxian ship. Thank you, sir, she said. She saluted. When he was alone, Magneus paced back and forth in his quarters. Normally he would have been fast asleep at this time in the cycle, but he could not quiet his mind or allow the time to pass. He worked out to try to calm his mind. The rapid exercises he had done since he first enrolled as a cadet. Sweat poured from his forehead and soaked through his shirt. His chest heaved as he lifted his own weight and shifted positions rapidly. He was getting older in macrocycles, but was still in remarkable shape. He remained ready to fight on every level. The Machian Defense Forces were a brutally efficient organization when it came to hierarchical control. Disputes and disagreements were settled with blood. The victor made the decisions. It was that simple. Magneus had come into his own rank as general in this violent environment. He had killed his superior officer. To gain and preserve his command, he did the same to all challengers from the ranks below. Orders were issued from the top down and carried out without question. Magneus was at the top. The question of who is in charge was usually painfully obvious. If it wasn't obvious, someone was likely about to challenge and seize power with violence. In urgent military situations, there was no time for disagreements or discussions. Decisions needed to be made and orders needed to be issued immediately. The hierarchy was established and maintained through the tradition of combat challenge. In the MDF, general was the highest rank. Each general was individually responsible, at least on paper, to the civilian government. Officially, the generals were equal, which meant they could not issue orders to each other. Although there was no rule that precluded a general to challenge another in combat, there was officially no benefit to challenge someone of equal rank. The generals were supposed to cooperate and serve the government. Being at the highest level of the military, they were assumed to be above petty politics. In practice, The generals were bloodthirsty warlords that each ran their own individual arm of the MDF. They vied for power within the organization and tried to control the course of the war against the Abraxians. The generals were the most ambitious and exceptional warriors among the Machi, physically capable of defending themselves against any soldier at any time, while they tactically managed planetary political struggles of unbelievable complexity. Like Magneus himself, they were dangerous men that had a mix of intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness. Magneus knew them all personally, having served with some of them in campaigns around the Luminary and having met others at official military ceremonies on Machi. Some of the generals he liked personally, and others he despised. He knew better than to trust any of them. General Volod was a short man with piercing green eyes and an infamously short temper. His small size made him an unlikely candidate for high rank, but he had easily dispatched every challenger who had come after him. He was also a good pilot, having led squadrons of fighters in Machi campaigns. Ever since he attained the rank of general, Volod had disappeared behind the veil of power. His secrecy was unsettling. Magneus wasn't sure if he had protected himself from spies and challengers, or whether he had planned something he didn't want the other Machian generals to know about. General Datan was the opposite of Volod in many ways, a head taller than the average Machian and much heavier. He was a natural combatant and had risen quickly in the ranks. He was loud, boastful, and quick to laugh. His physical strength was obvious, but it was his tactics that led to his fame on the battlefield and how he eventually promoted himself to the highest rank in the Machian military. Datan's personality made him seem like an unlikely rival within the MDF, but his natural charisma had endeared him to the enlisted men as well as Machian political and civilian leaders. He was becoming famous, and he was well-liked, which meant he might have greater ambitions. General Ervat was one of the old guard, having survived challenge after challenge into a respectable old age. His combat and tactical skills were legendary. He led some of the most important and victorious campaigns in Machian military history. He had not been as active in recent cycles, but he was said to consider himself senior to the other generals. Some had observed him talking down to his subordinates. He disrespected them and even included the generals of less seniority. Ervat was a powerful warrior and a wise tactician, but it was possible he considered himself the de facto leader based on experience, and Magneus couldn't be sure if he would collaborate with those he considered to be subordinated. They were all Machi, and they all served in the same organization, but Magneus harbored no illusions. He knew that these men were not his friends. They would kill him to eliminate a rival if he gave them a chance. Any of them would happily steal the resources on board the Abraxian destroyer and take all the military and political credit, having delivered it to the military treasury if they thought they could get away with it. Magneus knew he needed to somehow convince the generals that this plan to attack the Abraxian destroyer and expropriate the valuable natural resources being kept inside it would be not only good for Machi and the MDF, it would be good for each of them personally in their political struggles within the organization. Magneus was both an optimist and a pragmatist. He could see an opportunity presented itself, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Chapter 2. The Gum Accords. Thalia sent out emissaries to the other generals. Volod and Ervat were both deployed on Machi. Datan was on campaign in the inner system. Magneus proposed that they meet in a Machian-controlled area that could be secured. They settled on the desert world of Gum on the border of the inner luminary. It was neutral territory. Dust storms raged on the horizon when the shuttle from the MDF Reason landed. Magneus and Thalia walked out into the oppressive, dry heat. The orange-yellow atmosphere made the sky look burned. The sand whirled and stung any skin that was not covered. "Did we really need to come all this way?" Thalia asked. She wrapped a cloth scarf tighter around her face to protect herself. Magneus grimaced and covered his face with his sleeve to block the sand. No one was thrilled with the location. "It has to be neutral territory," Magneus explained. "Machi-controlled, but not by any of the generals. We're all in an unfamiliar space here." An armored vehicle transported them from the area to the local Machian military base. Through the tinted windows and the tornadoes of sand, they saw locals as they passed through colorful markets and drove small civilian vehicles on the narrow Gumian roads. Magneus casually entered through the front door of the military base that also served as the Machian embassy, and the official song of the MDF began to play over the loudspeakers. The workers stood solemnly at attention and saluted him. There were crafted banners placed around the office where they worked to compose intelligence briefs. They chanted his name. Magnus smiled and saluted back. He took time to individually shake the hand of everyone who worked there. To him, work should not be distracted by this type of event, but he knew that to each of the Machian soldiers he met, he was a celebrity. They would tell this story to their children. Magneus had never aspired to this kind of fame. It had come about as an accident. All he had ever wanted was to be a warrior and to fight for Machi. His ambition had only ever been to take control so that he could do what was right. Right for the men and women he fought with. Right for the MDF, and right for the civilian population on Machi. The relentless drive for power that had brought him to the level of general was motivated solely by a desire for victory. He knew better than the people above him, so he killed them and took over so that he could make the right decisions. He had never considered that the brutality he brought to his climb to the top of the MDF would eventually require him to become a politician who smiled and shook hands, then had to make arguments for the truth-tellers. It was strange to him that people knew his face and the sound of his voice. There were boys on Machi who had posters with his face on them. How had all those years of violence led to all this recognition? "Thank you, everyone," said Magneus. "Your work here in the GUM Bureau is so important. On behalf of the people of Machi and the MDF, I want to thank you for all your hard work and sacrifice." The workers clapped, and Magneus clapped along with them. "Sir," whispered Thalia into his ear, "we need to go. You have a meeting scheduled with the governor in a half a microcycle, as well as the mayor of Goat." Magneus nodded. He waved goodbye as the workers cheered. He exited through the front doors with his entourage and armed soldiers. In the front of the building, a vehicle waited to transport them to the city center for additional engagements. Thalia flipped through their schedule while Magneus fixed his uniform and took in the eerie orange sunset. The vehicle exploded. Thalia tackled Magneus to the ground while other soldiers flanked him protectively. His ears rang as he crouched low, surrounded by armored bodies. Time slowed to a crawl. There were shots from somewhere in the distance. It was hard to imagine where a shooter would hide. Apart from the gray military base, there was nothing but sand dunes and sparse desert shrubs for as far as the eye could see. The towers of the city were visible in the distance. They climbed above the horizon where brown sand met orange sky. "Stay down," said Thalia, as much to the security forces as to Magneus. She crouched with her blaster drawn, scanned the immediate area, and tried to find the threat. More blaster fire. In an instant, Thalia triangulated the trajectory. The attackers were crouched behind a vehicle and wore Machi uniforms. They were probably local Machi military, some of their own turned traitors. She fired on their position, and they ran. They tripped over themselves in panic. Thalia stood up. She had only an instant. She steadied her arm and aimed. She pulled the trigger. The first assailant fell to the ground where he was. She followed the other attacker with her blaster until she had a lock on him, and then squeezed the trigger again. She watched as the shot split his head open. His body spun to the ground. She whirled around, braced herself for more blaster fire. Beside her, Magneus was crouched with his sidearm drawn. "Are there others?" he asked. "Unsure," said Thalia. She sent 2 armed guards to scout the area. Thalia continued to scan the area until she was sure that there was no one else. Magneus stood up and looked around. "We got them," she said, and gave the all clear. "What the hell was that?" said Magneus. His hands were steady, but his eyes were full of rage. He put his blaster back in its holster. "Machian soldiers in a Machian military base firing on a general? It's not good," said Thalia. The armored vehicle smoldered where it had exploded. Tiny fires burned around them where pieces of debris had fallen. It was eerily quiet except for the crackle of the flames and the wind of the sandstorm. The bodies of the attackers were motionless and slowly getting covered in sand. Magneus hated these new security protocols. When they were attacked, it was his duty to protect himself first and crouch to the ground. He had to allow the security detail to surround him. He knew that his life was exceptionally valuable, strategically and politically. He was a Machian general. Somehow, none of that made it feel less cowardly to him. Hidden and crouched behind cover felt wrong. He wanted to fire back. He wanted to chase his attackers down and end them himself. He was grateful to Thalia and his security, but he couldn't repress the rage that overcame him at being attacked and being forced to hide. He was a general. "I don't know who is behind this, but they are going to pay dearly," said Magneus. "Yes, sir," said Thalia. "Should we head back inside and call for reinforcements?" "No," said Magneus. "Get a new vehicle. I'm not stopping. Let's go into town." Summits went on into the evening in the center of the city of Goat. Then the celebrations began with a banquet where Magneus was honored as a visiting general. Thousands of the richest, powerful, and important people in Goom assembled in the grand palace to eat, drink, listen to music, and pay tribute. Local dancers performed to local music on a stage while the banqueters ate and chatted with one another about the economy and the war. Magneus shook hands and spoke with some of the most prominent businessmen and military supporters before he took private appointments with the governor and the mayor. Both men were exceedingly kind and deferential, but neither of them had much to say. The meetings were ceremonial courtesy. They talked about the war, about shipping routes and commodities, about politics on Machi, and how the face of the luminary system had changed. They sipped expensive drinks and looked through the tall skyscraper windows at the city and the dunes beyond. When the gatherings were finished, Magneus couldn't remember the names of the men he had met or the substance of anything they had discussed. All he knew was that they were supposedly important, and he had to smile and shake their hands. "Are we almost done with all of this pageantry?" Magneus asked at the end of the night. "Yes, the civilians are happy. Tomorrow we meet with the generals." Thalia said, "One of them tried to have me killed. Our enemies couldn't infiltrate the MDF like this. I am going to shake 3 people's hands tomorrow and know for a fact that one of them tried to kill me." "It certainly looks that way. But which one?" asked Thalia. "That's the question," said Magneus. Magneus's entourage chose to spend the night in a shabby local Gotian lodging house, rather than on base, the mayor's home or the governor's mansion. None of the local military or politicians could be trusted. They had chosen the location almost at random. A soldier paid the proprietor to keep the place as empty as possible. This kept the identity of Magneus anonymous. Magneus slept on a hard bed in an economy room, staying under the name Dr. Varu. His security officers were at the windows and doors with blaster rifles. He fell asleep with his sidearm in his hand. The next morning, they left for the meeting in a new armored vehicle they acquired locally rather than one from the base. The meeting location was a town called Rayon, about 4 hours outside of Goat. It was small enough that it didn't have a local police force, and there were only a few hundred inhabitants total. The meeting place was a dusty little hole in the wall with sand on the floor and broken windows. Magneus was the last to arrive. He was dressed in his service uniform. The generals stood up when he entered. Volod was shorter than the others and dressed in casual clothes. Don was a behemoth in full general's uniform, including medals. He was larger in person than Magneus had imagined him to be from descriptions. Ervat was a wiry, graying man with a sly smile, and he wore a civilian-style suit. Magneus shook their hands one at a time, slowly, silently, and with great respect. He took his place at the table, and a waitress brought them a tall pitcher of Gumian liquor. Datan poured himself a glass. Thalia stood back by the door with one hand on her sidearm. She glanced through the windows at the dusty storm and kept an eye on the few locals working behind the bar. She had done everything possible to ensure where they met was secure. Thalia was aware that anything could happen, but after being ambushed yesterday, her opinion had changed. The 3 generals were thought to be honorable men. That was not the case. One of the generals had tried to have Magneus killed. "Why are we here then?" asked Ervat. "I'm here to offer you gentlemen an opportunity," said Magneus, "to enrich yourselves, build up our stockpile of resources against the Abraxians, and turn the tide of the war." "Go on," said Volod. He sat back in his chair with a bemused smile. I have the location of an Abraxian destroyer that is being used as a cache for resource collection. This ship contains more genium and metalloid citarine than you could imagine, enough for us to rebuild the entire fleet and then double it. What do you want us for, then? Asked Volod. He wants our help because he can't take the destroyer by himself, said Datan. If we combined forces, we could bring 4 Machian warships against the destroyer and disable it with energy weapons. That would allow us to put together a boarding team and transfer the resources to a civilian ship for transport back to the military treasury on Machi. Only one problem, said Volod. How do we trust you not to take all of the resources for yourself after we put our ships on the line for you? Right, said Ervat. What do we get out of this? How do we know this isn't a setup to make it look to the people on Machi like you are the one in command? Said Datan. Helping you would make us look politically like we are your foot soldiers. We know you are trying to build your political capital. What I am proposing is that we split the resources and the credit equally. We will issue a shared broadcast when the mission is successful. It will state that we are equally responsibility for this Machian victory. I know we have our differences, and some of us see the war differently than others, but for us to be successful against the Abraxians, we will need to put our disagreements aside, at least for this mission. You want backing to take down an Abraxian destroyer, said Ervat, in exchange for a share of the loot and the credit? That's correct, said Magneus. And we are supposed to trust you not to take all of the credit for yourself or steal the resources in the middle of the fighting when you get a chance, said Volod. We have to trust each other, Magneus said as best he could, knowing that one of them, maybe all of them, had made a bold move with the ambush yesterday. Ervat laughed. We each want to control the MDF, but none of us want to see Machian forces defeated by the Abraxians, the Batorians, or the Fovians. We are all loyal to the defense forces and to Machi. Let's win together, and we can divide up the empire later. You've been trying to make a name for yourself, said Datan. This suggests a planned publicity stunt. I am trying to do what is best for Machi and best for my men. I am curious, said Volod. What kind of resources are we talking about here? The mother lode, Thalia said, even though she knew was not part of the conversation. Genium, metalloid citarine, and commune, in addition to fuels and other components. The treasury needs it now more than ever. I will help, said Ervat. He sat back in his chair. What if one of us betrays the others and takes the resources? Asked Volod. What then? The MDF code prohibits space combat between Machian forces. We would be helpless. I could help you, and you could stab me in the back. There would be nothing that I could do. Let's say this. If one of us betrays the others, said Magneus, we will execute the traitor together. I don't care about the MDF code or what the civilians think. If a general betrays other generals, we will kill him. I can agree to that solution, said Datan. I will help as well. I still don't know, said Volod. I'm not convinced. It has to be unanimous, said Magneus, or else we don't do it at all. We need to apply the maximum amount of force to the Abraxian destroyer. I don't think we have enough power without all of us working together. We share the resources and the credit, said Volod, and anyone who breaks the agreement will die? Correct, said Magneus. All right, I agree, said Volod with caution in his voice. Magneus and the other generals stood up. They ceremonially shook hands and cemented the pact. They drank the rest of the Gumian liquor on the table and left. Their vehicles waited outside. One last thing, said Magneus as he put on his coat. Someone tried to kill me at the airbase outside of Got last night. Really? Said Ervat. Here on Gum? Who is behind it? Asked Datan. I don't know, said Magneus. His eyes were steely and cold as he looked at each of the generals. If I trace it back to one of you, I will not retaliate with soldiers. I will cut you to pieces personally. Am I understood? I wouldn't expect anything less, said Datan. Are we done here? Asked Ervat. Volod was silent. As Magneus and Thalia rode back to the city of Goat to board the shuttle and leave the planet, they watched the orange sky boil and the sandstorms swirl in the distance. Although the discussion had gone well, there was a tension in the air that both seasoned soldiers had recognized. There is something going on here, said Thalia. Definitely, said Magneus. We'll find out what it is sooner or later. The problem is that there is no way forward except to trust these people. There is no going back now. Chapter 3. The Battle of Lograt. The Machian forces wasted no time in preparing for the campaign. The Abraxian drones had almost finished their work in the debris field. It was cleared of valuable materials. Soon, those precious alloys and rare elements would be contained in the destroyer. Once that was complete, Magneus was certain the Abraxians would move the ship closer to a territory that they controlled so they could offload the resources into their own treasury where it would be more protected. Time was of the essence. They needed to engage the destroyer before it started to migrate back to Abraxian territory. While MDF Reason was on Machi, they performed minor repairs and brought on new soldiers. Dadan was now on Machi, along with Volod and Ervat. The generals had chosen to station their forces in different cities on the moon, which was now covered with more military personnel than it had been in macrocycles. As quickly as they had arrived, the forces of the MDF moved off Moon and took formation to attack the Abraxian destroyer where it orbited Lograt. The generals had planned to surround the destroyer and disable its defenses. The combat androids and energy weapons should be able to defeat its defenses. After the destroyer was disabled and helpless, the precious resources would be offloaded to a neutral transport. The transport ship would be piloted by a civilian crew so that there were no suspicions of theft or any kind of power grab. The generals had prepared to escort the transport ship back to Machi and have the resources unloaded into the treasury. An entire week of festivities on Machi had been secretly planned, along with a joint press conference in which the generals would make a show of being unified behind their shared victory. The MDF Reason took its place in orbit around the planet Lograt. On the bridge, they could see the massive, looming destroyer as it approached on the audio-visual comms monitors. "Give me a location check on the other generals," said Magneus. Thalia nodded. "We can see Volod approaching from the inner system, Ditan from behind the moon, and Ervat hovering near the meteor belt where we expect the Abraxian destroyer to flee." "Very good," said Magneus. The massive armed destroyer had attempted to maneuver out of the chokehold they were being put in. These tactics would have been enough to evade a single Machian warship, but there was no escape from the joint forces of the 4 top-tier Machian generals and their ships. The Abraxians understood they were surrounded. "We have the Abraxians trapped," said Magneus. "Confirm joint order to fire," said Volod. "Confirmed," said Magneus. "Confirmed," said Ervat. "Confirmed," said Datan. Thalia nodded and sent the communication. The massive engines on the MDF Reason heated up as the energy weapons energized and aimed at the Abraxian destroyer. The 4 warships fired at the destroyer simultaneously. Explosions rocked the destroyer and the shields flickered. The ship started to list but slowly righted itself. The energy weapons continued to fire. "The shields are not breaking down," said Magneus. "Increase the power." All the Machian energy weapons were fixed on the destroyer but had been unable to break through their defenses. They had not anticipated the destroyer would be able to take on 4 MDF warships at maximum power. Magneus wondered for a moment if he had miscalculated. "Increase the power," said Datan. "We're straining over here." "We are putting all our energy into the guns," said Ervat. "Brace yourselves," Thalia shouted. "The destroyer has a lock and is about to fire." A missile hit the MDF Reason on the port side. Power went down as the ship reeled from the impact. Emergency power came on while main engine power was being restored. Another missile hit to the Reason. The crew struggled to keep their balance. "We're taking heavy fire," said Magneus. "We're not breaking through the shields," said Ervat, as his ship was now being targeted. "We need to change things up now," said Volod, as he moved his ship to a different position. "Volod, why are you taking evasive maneuvers? You need to direct weapons at the weak points in the shield. We need to stand fast regardless of the missile fire." "Don't tell me what to do, Magneus," said Volod. "I'm going to take out the guns. We can focus on the shield after." "The shield is protecting the guns," Magneus said with frustration in his voice. "We need to target the weak point on the shields." "I'm not going to sit here and take missile fire," said Volod. "I'm focusing on the guns." Thalia looked over at Magneus from her station on the bridge. He knew what she thought. This argument had taken up too much time. If the energy weapon attacks were divided into two areas, the shield weak points and the weapon systems, it would make the attacks half as effective. "Should I redirect the energy weapons to target the Abraxian missile launchers?" asked Thalia, muting her microphone so that only Magneus could hear her. If Volod had already targeted the missile launchers, she suggested that the reason re-target so that the beams were focused on the same place. "No," said Magneus. He unmuted the mic. "Listen to me, Volod. I am asking you, not telling you, to target the shields. We need to disable the shields. They are protecting the missile batteries. We can't take the destroyer until we get those shields down." There was a long pause. Magneus looked at Thalia. She shrugged. They were not sure if the comms message had gone through. "Affirmative," said Volod. "Targeting the shields." "Thank you, brother," said Magneus. "Targeting the shields." "Affirmative. Targeting the shields," said Ervat and Datan. "Brace yourselves," said Magneus. "Here comes another round of missiles." The Abraxian destroyer glowed as it revved its engines and prepared to fire. The crew of the MDF Reason braced themselves at their stations on the bridge, while Magneus leaned forward in the captain's chair, his eyes fixed on the monitors showing the massive enemy ship. The Reason redirected power to the engines and avoided the approach of the missiles. The missiles turned around to hone in. The Reason got a firing solution and destroyed the missiles before they could hit the ship. The ship vibrated from the shock waves of the explosions, but there was no serious damage. "Damage report," cried Magneus. "Location on the generals." "Ervat," replied Thalia. She stopped herself and didn't continue. "What?" "He's dead, sir," Thalia stated in a battle-hardened manner. "What do you mean?" Thalia put the image on the main monitor. The Abraxian missiles had destroyed Ervat's ship. The hull of the ship was in pieces, blown apart with splintered sections that floated in all directions. Magneus realized in an instant that the Elder General had been killed along with his entire crew. "See what happens when we ride out fire?" asked Volod. "General Ervat is dead," said Datan. "We have lost a valuable partner." "By the 5 moons," said Volod. "It's not possible. I can't believe it." "Keep the weapons on the shields," said Magneus. "We need to get the shields down." "Stay alert for incoming fire," uttered Volod. "Keep the energy weapons on the shields," said Magneus. "They are going to break down. I know they will. Give it time. There is no other way." The bright beams of the energy weapons from the 3 ships continued to concentrate their power toward the weakest point in the Abraxian destroyer's defenses. The shield flickered and sparked as it started to fail. "It's working. It's finally working," said Magneus with relief. The destroyer was dark and exposed. The energy weapons began to burn a deep hole into the exterior of the ship. "Sir, the Abraxian defenses are down," said Thalia. "Confirmed the Abraxian shield is down," said Volod, "targeting the weapon systems." "Affirmative," said Magneus. "Shields are down, and we are redirecting our fire to the missile batteries." "Firing on Abraxian weapon systems," confirmed Dayton. "We need to move quickly," said Volod. "We are detecting additional incoming attacks." "Keep firing on the weapons," said Dayton. Another explosion rocked the MDF Reason. Alarms went off on the bridge. "Our shields are down," said Thalia, in a panic. The defenses that had protected the Reason had been destroyed by a missile hit. "What?" asked Magneus as the ships continued to try to disable 2 Abraxian weapons. "Our shield drive got hit. We're exposed. We won't survive another missile strike," said Thalia. "Keep firing on the missile batteries," shouted Magneus. He would not be defeated. "Sir, should we retreat?" asked Thalia. Officially, a tactical retreat could be issued. A ship damaged to this extent could move to a distance to make repairs. Any warship without a shield would be expected to try to get away and repair, rather than risk destruction. "No retreat," said Magneus. "This isn't a moment for cowardice. Full power to energy weapons." "Yes, sir," said Thalia. "Volod, do you read me? Are you there?" asked Magneus. "We could use some help here, Magneus," said Volod. "More missiles incoming. Our shields are down. We need to fire everything at once. This is our last chance. We do this for the Machi people." "For our people," said Volod. Volod's ship accelerated and raced toward the destroyer at the same time as the MDF Reason. Magneus focused on the destroyer as the engines strained and the ship vibrated. Without shields, they were completely exposed to the Abraxian attacks. Thalia gave the order to fire all weapons directly at the 4 missile batteries on the destroyer. The coordinates were entered, and the missiles were launched. The MDF Reason lurched and swerved as it took evasive maneuvers. It unloaded the explosive payload and then veered away from the burning destroyer. Volad's warship flew directly at the destroyer and fired its missiles at the same targets before it banked away in the opposite direction. When the maneuver was done, the Abraxian destroyer's defense capabilities were demolished. The missile batteries were burning craters on the exterior of the ship. Thalia looked at Magneus with a confident smile. The ship came around to the destroyer and the crew on the bridge cheered. "We did it," said Volod over the comm system. "The ship is ours. Congratulations, General," said Magneus. "And to you. Where is Dayton?" asked Volod. "Daton, come in," said Magneus. "Come in, Datan. Do you read?" "What is he doing?" said Volod. They both then saw the same data on the comms monitors. During the onslaught, they had been focused on the battle. Dan had been only focused on the destroyer. He had taken advantage of the fight to approach the blind side of the ship and attach. He had boarded the ship and stole the resources before the appropriate civilian transport ship arrived. "This isn't what we agreed, Datan," Volod screamed. "Get off the ship now, and we'll still have a deal. The transport is coming." "I hope you know what you're doing, Dayton," said Magneus, seething with rage. He thought about the attempt on his life on the planet Goom in the inner system. He now knew who the degenerate was that tried to assassinate him. Technically, any of the generals could have been behind the plot, but it was Datan who had most recently been on campaign in the inner system. "Thanks for the cover," said Dayton, "and for the Genium, the Citterine, and the Common. It belongs to me now." "Ervad is dead," said Volod. "A Machian general died for the spoils you are stealing." "I'm not stealing anything," said Danton defiantly. "I'm a general in the MDF. I'm seizing war materials for Machi." "We had a deal," said Magneus. "You swore to us." "Listen to him," said Don, laughing over the comm systems. "We had a deal. You would have done the same thing to me, Magneus. You just didn't get the chance." "You're not going to get away with this," Volod said, seething with contempt. "I already did," said Datan. "There is nothing you can do to stop me. The Machian code prohibits you from firing on my ship. I can do anything I want to. I suppose you can cry to the civilian government when you get back to Machi, but I doubt you will. You wouldn't want to show weakness at being fooled." "I'm going to kill you, Datan," said Volod. "We had a deal. I'm going to tear your heart out of your chest." "If you could, you would have already, Volod." "You are betraying Machi," said Magneus. "I don't think the people of our precious moon will see it that way. I think they will see me as a war hero, returning from a dangerous campaign with everything our people need to win. I think they will see you as a political rival who is crying over unfairness in the military." "This is not how this ends," Magneus said while he worked on a plan to take Dayton's ship. "That's the problem with generals like you, Magneus. And Volod, you can't stop thinking like a soldier even when things become political. You're not willing to do what you really need to do to lead the MDF." "I'm going to fire," Volod said over a private channel to Magneus. "The code was written for honorable men, not schemers." "Wait," said Magneus. "If we fire on the ship, we'll look like renegades, not Don." "He's right. Machian civilians understand the code. They won't be on our side if we fire on Dayton. It will only give him more support, maybe even make him a martyr. We must be careful to not destroy the resources we came here to take." "Is your suggestion to let him get away with it?" said Volod. "To let him betray us and take all the credit for our victory when Ervad is dead because of his selfishness and cowardice?" "No," said Magneus. "I have something else in mind." Chapter 4. The Machian Code. After Datan's ship was loaded full of valuable Genium, metalloid, Citterine, and Common, it departed from the space around Lograt and started the journey back to Machi. It was flanked by a contingent of Datan's forces, gunships and scouts. They had waited outside the battle zone until Datan called them for escort. Datan stopped communications with the other generals. There was no sense in arguing about what had already happened. The comms were quiet. On Machi, his political allies and friends had prepared a massive celebration in his name. Upon return to Machi, Datan's political allies had planned to broadcast a speech about the triumph which gave all the credit to Datan. He would be given complete responsibility for the tactical victory as well as the spoils. The civilian government would award him the highest Medal of Honor. At that point, Datan had planned to promote himself to Grand Admiral, a new level in the military which controlled the entire MDF. As Grand Admiral, he would seize complete control of the MDF and dictate to the other generals what the strategy would be for the rest of the war against the Abraxians. When the conflict was over, if it ever really ended, and if such a conflict was even winnable, he would be in a position of victory that would allow him to be crowned Emperor of the Five Moons and the entire luminary system. He raced back to Machi with the collected war materials. Datan wanted his name to be remembered through the centuries. With this victory, he felt sure it would. "General, the extra weight is causing increased fuel consumption," said a bridge officer. "We're not going to be able to make it back to Machi without refueling." "Are you sure?" asked Datan. "Yes, sir. We can refuel at Gum. Prepare a landing." The Sandy World was a place where Datan had many connections. Although his family was from Machi, he had campaigned in and around the inner system of the Luminary for years. He had many close friends and allies on Gum, both in the military and the civilian population. Datan had used his power as a general to control the flow of contraband materials through Gum. He profited from the corruption and larceny that happened there. It was his backyard, and he controlled it with an iron fist. His attempt to kill Magneus had failed. The soldiers he had paid to open fire on the general were dead, and both he and Commander Thalia had survived. So far, the plot had not been traced back to him. What Dayton truly feared more than any combatant was bad publicity. He knew he needed the full support of the Machian people, and the attempt to assassinate a fellow general would never be accepted. He was the clear victor, and would be rewarded as such when he returned to Machi. Dayton had outmaneuvered his rivals in the Battle of Lograd and seized the resources, which led to an even better outcome than the attempted murder. He managed to sideline and embarrass his rivals. Dayton's ship landed on the airfield outside Goat. He stepped out into the warm air, breathing in the scent of the desert. The ship started to refuel immediately. As he watched the men work, he scanned the area for any signs of trouble. He wanted to get back to Machi as soon as possible. Every hour that he was delayed was a source of concern. The cargo he carried was too precious. He had not risen to the rank of general by taking things for granted. "Why is this taking so long?" Tan shouted. "We need to get out of here." "Hello, Datan," Magneus said with a smug look on his face. "What?" Datan whirled around quickly to see Magneus, Thalia, and Volod emerge from the doors of the base along with an entourage of soldiers that carried heavy weapons. His own soldiers raised their rifles. It was now Machian versus Machian. The atmosphere was filled with tension as Magneus' soldiers along with Volod's moved into formation to surround Datan and his ship. "You should not have crossed us, Datan," said Volod. "You should have thought about your fuel consumption before you hatched a plan to steal from us and run away." "Magneus," said Dayton, "you might have me cornered and outnumbered, but what you are doing is a bad idea. Killing a general in cold blood while on a Machian military base will not look very good for you, politically." "Who said anything about cold blood?" said Magneus. "Dayton, I challenge you for rank." "We have the same rank. We are both generals." "There's nothing in the Machian code against it. I have a right to challenge you." "It's never been done," Dayton said, realizing that he may have to defend himself. "You are correct. There is a first time for everything. Choose a weapon." "I don't have to agree to this." Dayton was defiant with his answer. Magneus stripped down to his waist. His uniform disguised his muscular build. He handed his shirt to Thalia and selected a curved blade from one of his soldiers to use as a weapon. Dayton stared on, uncomfortably. He knew that Magneus was known for his brutality. Dayton looked at his own troops, who stared back at him blankly. He mentally ran through his options and wondered how he could get out of the duel. "You know the Machian code. You can't refuse a challenge. This isn't legitimate. You can't challenge me. We are both generals." "If you won't fight back," said Magneus, "this will go a lot faster." "Fine," said Dayton. He spit into the dust, his face contorted with anger. He unbuttoned his shirt and gestured to one of his officers to bring him a weapon. You're 10 years older and 100 pounds lighter than I am. You don't stand a chance." Talk, said Magneus. "I've killed 180 men to make this rank," said Dotun. "I kill a challenger a week. I'm going to make an example out of you to show the others. I am the greatest warrior this fighting force has ever known. I am the political mind of our generation. I rule the MDF." "If you say so," said Magneus. "You were outsmarted. Why can't you accept that?" asked Dayton, trying to stall for time. "You lost. If others follow your example, how will we be able to unify and defeat the Abraxians? How will we cooperate if we are all just out for ourselves? We must be able to trust each other, or our enemies will use that against us." "In the end, the MDF will be unified," said Dayton. "Behind me, not you." Dayton's attendant handed him a sinister-looking serrated blade. His massive frame was physically impressive. His distinct musculature was covered in a patchwork of scars from the challenges he had survived. Although Magneus was large in stature for an average Machian, Dayton towered over him and outweighed him significantly. The enlisted men at the airbase, as well as the forces loyal to both sides, assembled as an impromptu audience in a circle around the two warriors. There was no difference between soldiers in the MDF when a challenge was taking place. They were all equal spectators, even if they were cheering for different sides. They cried out for blood. Don waved his hand and the battle began. Magneus encroached slowly on him. He took careful steps in his direction. Don took a cautious step back and then launched himself forward. His body carried the weighty momentum of a charging bull. He swung his blade at Magneus's chest. The wide swing was easily blocked. Magneus grunted as he pushed back against the force Dayton brought with the blade. As the edges of the blades scraped together, sparks flew. Dayton laughed. "You got yourself in over your head, old man." Magneus deflected the blade and counterattacked with a quick thrust at Dayton's chest. He took a quick jump backward and narrowly avoided the slash. The men cheered. "You could have worked with us," said Magneus. "We could have shared the glory." Dayton spat onto the dusty asphalt. "You would have just stolen the merchandise for yourself." "There is no honor among thieves, Magneus. You know that. Do you really pretend, even to yourself, that you are always doing the right thing?" Magneus feigned a broad swing with his curved blade and then slid at Dayton's feet. His boot struck Dayton's ankle, and the heavy man stumbled but didn't fall. Dayton stabbed downward at Magneus on the ground, but he rolled out of the way just in time and leapt back to his feet. The two generals encircled each other again. Neither had drawn blood. Dayton lunged forward and whirled his blade in a high arc. Magneus spun to one side and dodged the swing. He stabbed back at his assailant. The blade dealt a glancing blow to Dayton. It was not a deep or serious injury, but blood began to flow down Dayton's side, and he grimaced in pain. "How long has it been since someone struck a general?" he asked. "Too long," said Magneus. He swung again, this time lower. He aimed to cut Dayton's feet out from under him. The enemy general jumped to avoid the blade and counterattacked with a downward strike. This time his blade connected with Magneus's flesh. It sliced into his body behind the shoulder blade. Thalia moved to the front of the audience. She knew she couldn't intervene. It was against the Machian code. Once the battle had begun, only death could stop it. She bit her lip and stared as Magneus fell onto the sandy ground. He bled from the wound in his shoulder. She couldn't bear to see him die, defeated like this. She held her breath. Magneus started to crawl away, and Dayton pursued him. He raised the blade high into the air to decapitate him. He grunted as his chest and biceps flexed to bring the maximum amount of force down on the fleeing general. Magneus rolled at the last second, and the blade hit the asphalt. Sparks flew as metalloid alloy contacted solid ground. Dayton stumbled forward, off kilter with the momentum of the strike. Magneus stabbed upward from where he lay on the ground. His curved blade slid upward into Dayton's neck, through his mouth, and into his brain. The crowd cheered as they recognized victory immediately. Dayton was killed instantly, even before the red foam began to spill out of his mouth as his eyes rolled back into his head. Dayton fell to the ground, the blade still extended from his jaw. Magneus brushed off the dust and lifted himself up off the ground. His shoulder bled profusely. He huffed from the pain and the exertion as he got to his feet. The crowd roared, and the soldiers began to chant his name. Magus, Magneus, Magneus. Long live the general, long live the general. The adrenaline made him want to scream until his vocal cords were ragged. His chest heaved with involuntary hyperventilating breaths. He could barely move his arm. The sandy asphalt around him was stained dark with blood. His enemy was dead, face down in front of him. The crowd cheered for him. Their excitement and exultation was endless. Magneus, Magneus, Magneus. Long live the general, long live the general. Thalia called for a medic and went over to Magneus. She gingerly examined the wound behind his shoulder blade and handed him water. It tasted like the blood running down his throat. She helped the medic apply an emergency patch to the wound. Somehow, once again, his combat ability had delivered him from an impossible situation. His instincts had kept him alive. His power had grown once again. As the soldiers cheered, he realized that he was now without question. He controlled the MDF. His support within the ranks was unanimous. Volod nodded with approval from the sidelines. The two of them had developed a trusted relationship, having been betrayed and pursued revenge together. Magneus knew he could count on Volod's support. "You did it," Thalia declared. She couldn't contain her relief that Magneus was alive after the heightened tension of the battle. "We got the resources back." "It's more than that," said Magneus. "We have secured the future." Chapter 5. The Seat of Power. When the Reason returned to Machi, it was loaded with half of the quantity of the resources that had been retrieved from the Abraxian destroyer. Volod brought the other half in his own ship. Their convoy was received by an entourage of civilian craft. When they landed and turned over the resources to the treasury, there was a roar of exhilaration and hope. Later that same day, a ceremony was held for the fallen hero, Urvat. The stories about him were told over and over again, as the Machian public remembered his life. Pictures of him were everywhere. This type of loss in the line of duty was tremendous. He would become a symbol of heroism for the Machi people. Datan's betrayal became infamous overnight. His name became a derogatory term for anyone who turned on their friends and compatriots, a reminder that no one was above justice. Magneus and Volod both met with the civilian government. They pledged their loyalty and cooperation to each other and to the MDF. The ceremonies went on for a week. "I'm sick of all of this show and pageantry," said Magneus. "There is a war going on out there." "Yes, however," said Thalia, "your leadership is our best hope against the Abraxians right now, and in order for us to have you as our leader, we need you to reassure the population." Magneus's shoulder healed, and he appeared when and where he could in public to crowds that cheered over and over again. The Machian economy improved as the civilian infrastructure was put to work on new high-tech gunships and destroyers that would turn the tide of the war. Across the entire moon, truth-tellers issued new statements about the state of politics and the military in the luminary system. Thalia collected intelligence on other rivals that had emerged to challenge Magneus for power. Machi was transforming. The end.